When a fugitive mother and 7 stolen children collapsed on his doorstep, widowed rancher Jonah Carter had to choose: turn them over to the law or become an outlaw himself. If you're ready for a story about courage, sacrifice, and the family we choose when the world turns against us, stay with me until the very end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story can travel. The winter wind cut across the Montana plains like a blade fresh from the whetstone, sharp enough to split skin and bitter enough to steal breath. Jonah Carter stood on the porch of his ranch house, coffee cooling in his tin cup, watching the horizon blur beneath a sky the color of old iron. The world felt empty out here, deliberately so. He'd built this isolation carefully, fence post by fence post, after burying his wife 3 years back. The silence was his choice. The loneliness was his penance. Then he saw them. Then he saw, at first, just shadows moving against the snow, too many to be wolves, too slow to be deer. Jonah set down his cup and squinted into the pale morning light. 7 small figures stumbled through the drifts, their dark shapes hunched and unsteady. And ahead of them, barely upright, a woman. She moved like something broken trying to hold itself together. One arm wrapped tight around her ribs, the other reaching back toward the children who followed her in a ragged line. Her coat was dark with something that wasn't snow. Even from a distance, Jonah could see the way she swayed with each step, the way her boots dragged furrows through the white. She was dying. He didn't think, didn't calculate. Jonah vaulted the porch rail and ran. The wind threw ice into his face as he crossed the open ground between the house and the edge of his property. The woman saw him coming, her head lifted, eyes wild and dark, and for a moment he thought she might turn and run. But her knees buckled instead, and she went down hard, the snow rising up around her like a shroud. "No!" The word tore from her throat, raw and desperate. "The children!" Jonah dropped beside her, his hands already moving to assess the damage. Blood soaked through her coat on the left side, just below her ribs, the fabric stiff and frozen. A bullet wound. Recent enough that the bleeding hadn't fully stopped. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Just hold on." "Not me." Her hand shot out and gripped his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes, green as summer grass and just as fierce, locked onto his. "The children. Promise me." Behind her, the 7 children had stopped. They stood in the snow like fence posts, silent and wide-eyed. The oldest couldn't have been more than 13. The youngest looked barely 5, a little girl with tangled dark hair and a face streaked with tears that had frozen on her cheeks. "I promise," Jonah heard himself say, though he had no idea what he was promising or why. The woman's grip loosened, her eyes fluttered closed. Jonah lifted her as carefully as he could, feeling how light she was beneath the heavy coat, how her breathing came shallow and quick. She didn't wake. He turned to the children, these 7 strangers who'd walked out of the wilderness with a dying woman. "Come with me," he said. "All of you, right now." The oldest boy, tall and thin, with dark hair and darker eyes, stepped forward. "Is she gonna die?" Jonah looked down at the woman in his arms, at the blood that had started seeping through his own sleeve now. "Not if I can help it, but we need to move. Can you get the others to the house?" The boy nodded once, sharp and certain, then turned to the younger children. "You heard him. Follow me. Stay together." They moved as one unit, practiced and silent, through the snow toward the ranch house. Jonah led the way, his boots breaking trail, the woman's weight somehow both substantial and fragile in his arms. Behind him, he could hear the soft crunch of small feet, the occasional whisper quickly hushed. Inside, the house still held the warmth from the morning fire. Jonah kicked the door shut behind the last child and carried the woman straight to his bedroom, the only bed in the house. He laid her down on the quilt his wife had made, the one he'd kept pristine for 3 years, untouched and perfect. Blood immediately began to soak into the blue and white pattern. "Oldest boy," Jonah called out. "What's your name?" "Luke." The boy appeared in the doorway, his face pale but steady. "Luke, I need you to keep the others in the main room. Start a fire in the stove if it's gone down. There's bread in the tin by the window and milk in the cold box. Make sure everyone eats something." "What about her?" I'm going to try to save her life." Jonah was already moving, pulling out the medical supplies he kept in the chest at the foot of the bed: needles, thread, whiskey, clean cloth. "Can you handle the children alone for a while?" Luke's jaw tightened. "Yes, sir." "Good man." The boy disappeared, pulling the door closed behind him. Through the wood, Jonah could hear him speaking low and calm to the others, organizing them like a seasoned trail boss with a green crew. Whoever these children were, they'd learned discipline somewhere. Jonah turned back to the woman and began the grim work of cutting away her coat and shirt. The bullet had entered just below her rib cage on the left side, the wound puckered and dark. He probed gently. The bullet had gone clean through, exiting near her spine. That was good. No digging required. But she'd lost a lot of blood, and the wound showed signs of infection starting to set in around the edges. He cleaned it as best he could, poured whiskey directly into the wound. She jerked and moaned but didn't wake, and began to stitch. His hands remembered the work from the war, from patching up ranch hands after accidents, from the dozens of injuries that came with living this far from town. Each stitch pulled tight and even, closing the torn flesh. When he finished, he bandaged her carefully and covered her with blankets. Her face, cleaned of trail dust and blood, was younger than he'd expected. Maybe 30, maybe less. Strong features, a firm jaw, dark hair that had come loose from its braid. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't place it. He left her sleeping and went to check on the children. They'd arranged themselves around the main room with the careful precision of people used to making themselves small. The three youngest sat together on the old sofa, the little girl he'd noticed first, another girl, maybe 7, and a boy around the same age. The middle children, 2 boys who looked like brothers, shared the hearth. Luke stood by the window watching the horizon. Every single one of them turned to look at Jonah when he emerged. "She's alive," he said, "sleeping. She's going to need rest and care, but I think she'll make it." The tension in the room didn't ease. If anything, it seemed to wind tighter. "Are you going to turn us in?" Luke asked. The question landed like a stone in still water. Jonah studied the boy's face. The careful blankness that didn't quite hide the fear underneath, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "Turn you in for what? You don't know who she is?" "No idea." Luke's eyes narrowed, measuring truth. Whatever he found in Jonah's face seemed to satisfy him, because his shoulders dropped an inch. "Her name's Sarah Hale. There's a price on her head, $500 for information leading to her capture." $500. That was more than most men made in a year out here. Jonah felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What's the charge?" "Murder." The word came from one of the middle boys, bitter and hard. "They say she killed a man in Denver." "Did she?" 7 pairs of eyes stared at him. Finally, Luke spoke. "No, sir. But the man who's saying she did, he's the one who actually pulled the trigger, and he's powerful enough that nobody questions him." Jonah moved to the stove and poured himself coffee from the pot that someone, probably Luke, had already started. The bitter heat of it helped him think. A wanted woman and 7 children who'd walked through a Montana winter to get here. A bullet wound that spoke of pursuit. A boy who talked about power and lies like he'd lived them firsthand. "Who are you kids to her?" he asked. The question seemed to catch them off guard. The children exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, the little girl on the sofa spoke up, her voice small but clear. "She saved us." "From what?" "From him." Luke's voice had gone flat. "Victor Hale. The man who shot her. The man who killed—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "He's her husband. Was her husband. She ran when she found out what he'd done. And we ran with her." The pieces were starting to come together, though the picture they made was ugly. "He's coming after her. He's coming after all of us," Luke said. "He wants her dead and us back under his control. We're worth money to him. That's all we ever were." Jonah set down his coffee cup. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass. Inside, 7 children waited for him to decide their fate. In his bedroom, a woman named Sarah Hale lay sleeping, her blood on his wife's quilt, a murder charge hanging over her head, and a powerful man hunting her. The smart thing would be to hitch up the wagon, Drive into town and collect that $500. Let the law sort out who was telling the truth. Keep himself clear of whatever mess these people had brought to his doorstep. But Jonah had seen the way Sarah Hale gripped his wrist in the snow, the way her first thought wasn't for herself, but for the children. He'd seen how these kids moved together, how they looked to Luke for leadership, how even the youngest among them knew how to be quiet and careful and afraid. He'd been alone for 3 years. He'd chosen that. Built walls around himself and told himself it was enough. Now his walls had 7 children inside them and a dying woman in his bed. "How long since you all ate a real meal?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise them. The 7-year-old boy piped up. "2 days, mister." "3," one of the middle boys corrected. "That stale bread yesterday doesn't count." Jonah nodded. "Luke, you know how to cook?" "Some." "Good. There's bacon in the cold box, eggs, potatoes. Make breakfast for everyone. The rest of you, when's the last time you slept somewhere warm?" Silence. "Right. After you eat, you're all going to sleep. I've got bedrolls in the storage room, blankets, pillows. We'll make space." He looked at each face in turn. "I don't know what your story is yet. I don't know what you're running from or what's true and what isn't. But I know you're children, and you're cold, and you're hungry, and that woman in there nearly died getting you to safety." He paused, letting the weight of what he was about to say settle on his own shoulders before he spoke it aloud. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay. All of you. For now, at least, you're safe here." The relief that washed across those 7 faces was almost painful to see. The little girl started crying, not sad tears, but the kind that came when something tight and terrible finally loosened its grip. One of the middle boys covered his face with his hands. Luke's jaw worked like he was trying to hold back words that might break if he let them out. "Why?" Luke finally managed. "You don't know us. You could get in trouble for this." Jonah thought about his answer, about the empty house he'd been living in, the silence he'd wrapped around himself like armor, the way he'd stopped being a part of the world after Martha died, about how easy it had been to let everything good just drift away. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply, "and because I've got the room." It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't even complete, but it was true. And these children had probably been lied to enough. Luke nodded once, sharp and serious. "Thank you, sir." "Jonah. Name's Jonah Carter, and you're welcome." They ate breakfast in shifts, the older boys cooking while the younger children huddled around the stove, soaking up warmth like dry earth soaking up rain. Jonah checked on Sarah twice, changing her bandages, making sure the bleeding had stopped. She slept through it all, her breathing steady now, color starting to come back to her face. By midday, they'd settled into a strange new rhythm. The children claimed spaces around the house, the girls taking the sofa, the younger boys spreading bedrolls by the fire, the older ones making do with the corners. They moved quietly, efficiently, like they'd had practice making themselves fit into small spaces. Jonah stood on the porch again, coffee in hand, watching the horizon. Somewhere out there, a man named Victor Hale was looking for his wife and 7 children. A man powerful enough to put a price on a woman's head and make murder charges stick. A man who thought children were property worth pursuing across state lines in the dead of winter. The smart thing would still be to turn them in. Jonah looked back through the window at his house, no longer empty, no longer silent, at children eating bread and warming their hands, at Luke standing guard even now, watching over the others, at the closed bedroom door and the woman sleeping beyond it, who'd taken a bullet and walked through a blizzard to save 7 lives that weren't even her own. "Let him come," Jonah said to the wind. "Let him try." He didn't know if he meant it as a promise or a threat. Maybe both. But he knew, with the kind of certainty that settled deep in a man's bones, that he wasn't turning these people over to anyone. Not for $500. Not for any amount of money. Whatever was coming, they'd face it here. Night fell early and hard, the temperature dropping fast enough that Jonah could hear the wood in the house contracting, groaning against the cold. He'd spent the afternoon showing the boys where things were: the barn, the well, the woodpile, the chicken coop. They'd absorbed information like students who knew their lives might depend on the lesson. Luke had proven himself the natural leader, but the others had their strengths too. Tommy, one of the middle boys, had a way with animals. The horses had gentled under his hands immediately. Ben, his brother, had good instincts about work that needed doing, already stacking wood without being asked. The younger boys, Sam and David, stuck close together but pitched in where they could. The girls were harder to read. The oldest, Emma, watched everything with careful eyes, helping the younger ones, Ruth and little Lily, settle in. They'd been quiet all day, speaking only when spoken to, moving like ghosts through the house. Sarah hadn't woken. Jonah checked on her again as the sun set, changing bandages in the dim light from the oil lamp. The wound looked better, no fresh bleeding, no spreading infection, but she was pale, her breathing too shallow. He'd seen men die from blood loss after the bleeding stopped, their bodies just giving up. "Don't you dare," he told her, his voice low. "You didn't walk through hell to die in a warm bed." Her eyelids flickered but didn't open. Back in the main room, the children had gathered for dinner. More of the bacon, beans from the cellar, biscuits that Emma had somehow coaxed into existence from his sparse supplies. They ate with the focused intensity of people who knew hunger intimately. "Tell me how you all met, Sarah," Jonah said, once the meal was finished and they sat around the fire, bellies full for the first time in days. The children looked at each other. Finally, Emma spoke. "Victor Hale ran an orphanage in Denver, called it the Hale Foundation for Children, made himself look like a saint, taking in kids nobody wanted." Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped her skirt tight enough to whiten her knuckles. "But it wasn't charity. He worked us. Sold the older boys to mines and railroads. Sold the girls to—" She stopped, swallowed. "He sold us." Jonah felt rage kindle in his chest, hot and sudden. "Sarah came to work there about a year ago," Luke continued. "She was supposed to keep books, manage the house. But she started noticing things. How kids would disappear. How Victor would come back from his trips with money and no children. She started asking questions. And he didn't like that," Jonah guessed. "He tried to make her stop, threatened her, but she wouldn't." Luke's voice carried something like awe. "She started keeping her own records, writing down names, dates, where the children went, building proof. Then she found out what happened to my brother." Tommy's voice cracked. "Victor said Peter got adopted, said some nice family took him. But Sarah found the bill of sale. Found out Victor sold him to a mining company in Wyoming. Sold him like he was cattle." The fire cracked and popped in the silence that followed. "She went to Victor's brother, James," Emma said. "He was a lawyer. She thought if she showed him the evidence, he'd help. He was a good man. He believed her. He confronted Victor," Luke said. "Told him he was going to expose everything, go to the marshals, shut the whole operation down. And Victor shot him," Ben finished. "Right there in the office. We were in the next room. We heard everything." Jonah's hands had clenched into fists without him realizing it. "And then blamed Sarah." "Victor's rich," Luke said. "Has half the city officials in his pocket. His lawyer made it look like Sarah and James were working together to steal from the foundation. Made it look like she killed James to cover it up. By the time the marshals came, Victor had already arranged for witnesses, people who'd swear they saw Sarah shoot James. And you all ran." "Sarah broke us out the night before the trial," Emma said. "Told us we had to move fast and quiet. We walked for 3 days before we could steal horses. Rode until they gave out. Then walked some more." She looked at Jonah, her young face ancient with exhaustion. "She got shot protecting us. When Victor's men caught up, she put herself between them and us. Took the bullet meant for Luke." Luke's face had gone rigid. "She told us to run. We wouldn't leave her. We carried her." "For 2 days," Ben added, "taking turns, until we saw your ranch." Jonah sat back, the full weight of their story settling over him. An orphanage turned into a slave market. A good man murdered for trying to stop it. A woman who'd risked everything was still risking everything to save children who weren't her own. And 7 kids who'd carried a dying woman through a Montana winter rather than leave her behind. "Your brother," he said to Tommy. "Peter, you know where he is?" Tommy shook his head, tears sliding down his face. "Sarah tried to find out, but the company moved him. Could be anywhere by now." Could be dead, Jonah thought, but didn't say. Mining companies weren't known for their care of workers, let alone children bought off a criminal's ledger. "I'm sorry," he said instead. I'm sorry that happened to you, to all of you. It's not your fault, Mr. Jonah, Sam said. The boy couldn't have been more than 8, his face still round with childhood despite everything he'd seen. You didn't do nothing wrong. No, Jonah agreed. But a lot of people did. A lot of people looked the other way while Victor Hale bought and sold children like commodities. That's what Sarah said, Emma told him. She said the worst thing wasn't Victor being evil. It was everyone else being comfortable with it. Everyone else deciding that looking away was easier than looking at the truth. Smart woman, Jonah thought. Brave woman. The kind who'd make a stand even when it cost her everything. How long do you think before Victor figures out where you are? He asked Luke. The boy considered. We covered our trail pretty well, and the snow will have hidden the last of it, but he's not going to stop looking, and when he does figure it out, Luke met Jonah's eyes steadily. He'll come with enough men to make sure we don't get away again. How many men does he have? Last count? Maybe 20 who'd do whatever he asked, no questions. Plus, whoever he can hire with the money he's made selling kids. 20 armed men against one rancher, a wounded woman, and 7 children. The mathematics weren't favorable. We'll deal with it when it happens, Jonah said. For now, let's focus on getting through tonight. You all need rest. Real rest. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out what comes next. The children dispersed to their claimed spaces, settling into bedrolls with the practiced efficiency of people used to making do with little. Luke lingered by the fire. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. You could turn us in, collect the reward. Nobody would blame you. Jonah poked at the fire, watching sparks rise up the chimney. My wife died 3 years back. Fever took her fast. 1 week she was fine, the next she was gone. We'd been trying for children. Never happened. After she passed, I told myself I was fine alone. Easier that way. Less risk of losing someone again. He set down the poker and looked at Luke. Then you all showed up. 7 kids and a woman who's nearly dead from saving you. And I realized I've been using being alone as an excuse. Calling it peace when it was really just giving up. He paused. I don't know if I can protect you from what's coming. Don't know if I'm strong enough or smart enough or prepared enough. But I know I'm not going to stand aside and let evil men take children away to God knows what fate. Not when I've got the means to fight. Luke's eyes had gone bright. He nodded once, sharp and fierce. Then we'll fight with you. You're a child. I'm 13. I've been working like a man since I was 9. I can shoot, ride, and I don't scare easy. Luke's jaw set in a line that reminded Jonah of soldiers he'd known during the war. Boys who'd grown up too fast and learned to be hard because soft didn't survive. Those kids in there? They're my responsibility. Have been since Victor took us. I've kept them alive this long. I'm not stopping now. Jonah studied the boy. Not quite a man, not quite a child, but something forged in between. Fair enough? But we do this smart. No heroics. We plan, we prepare, and we don't take unnecessary risks. Agreed? Agreed. They shook on it, the boy's grip firm and sure. That night, Jonah lay awake in the chair beside Sarah's bed, listening to the house settle around him. The wind had picked up again, howling around the eaves, rattling the shutters. Snow whispered against the windows. But inside the house was warm, full of the small sounds of sleeping children, soft breathing, the occasional murmur, the rustle of blankets. Sarah stirred for the first time since morning, her head turning on the pillow, a small sound of pain escaping her lips. Jonah leaned forward. Sarah, can you hear me? Her eyes opened, just slits at first, then wider as consciousness returned. She looked around the unfamiliar room, confusion and fear chasing across her face until her gaze landed on him. The children, she whispered, her voice raw. Where? Safe. All of them. Sleeping in the next room. The tension went out of her body so completely that Jonah thought she might pass out again, but she held on, her eyes searching his face. Who are you? Jonah Carter. This is my ranch. You collapsed on my property this morning. I've been patching you up. You know who I am? I know what the children told me. I know there's a price on your head. I know a man named Victor Hale shot you and is probably looking for you. He paused. I know you're innocent. Her eyes filled with tears. How can you possibly know that? Because guilty people don't take bullets for other people's children. And because those kids in there look at you like you hung the moon. Children know who to trust. Animals, too. And both have good instincts about people. A tear slid down her temple into her hair. You should turn us in. Save yourself the trouble. Too late for that. Already decided I'm keeping you. A startled laugh broke from her, sharp and painful sounding. You're keeping us? All of you, until this is sorted out. Jonah leaned back in his chair. Now rest. You've lost a lot of blood and you've got a long way to heal. We can talk more when you're stronger. Victor will come, she warned. He'll bring men. Let him come. This is Montana, not Denver. Out here, a man's ranch is his castle, and I defend what's mine. She studied his face for a long moment, this stranger who'd taken in her and 7 orphaned children without hesitation, who'd made promises he had no reason to keep. Thank you, she finally whispered. I don't even know you, but thank you. You're welcome. Now sleep. She did, slipping back under almost immediately, her breathing evening out. Jonah sat in the darkness, listening to the wind and the children and the quiet sounds of a house that was no longer empty. Somewhere out there, a dangerous man was looking for them. Men with guns and money and the law twisted to their purposes. They'd come eventually. Could be days, could be weeks, but they'd come. And when they did, Jonah would be ready. He'd lost his wife to forces he couldn't fight, disease and chance and the cruelty of an indifferent world. But this was different. This was evil with a human face, evil that could be opposed, that should be opposed. These children had already lost too much. So had Sarah. They'd run far enough, sacrificed enough, bled enough. This was where the running stopped. This was where they made their stand. Dawn came slow and reluctant, the sky lightening from black to gray like old dishwater. Jonah had dozed in the chair, waking every hour to check Sarah's breathing, to add wood to the fire, to listen for sounds that didn't belong. When full morning finally arrived, he found Luke already awake in the main room, sitting by the window with a rifle across his lap. Where'd you get that? Jonah asked. Found it in the storage room. Hope you don't mind. Luke didn't take his eyes off the horizon. Figured someone should keep watch. You know how to use it? Sarah taught me. She taught all of us, once we left Denver. Said we needed to know how to protect ourselves. The boy's jaw was set hard, his profile sharp against the pale light. I'm not very good yet, but I can hit what I'm aiming at mostly. Jonah crossed to the window and looked out at his land. The barn, the frozen pasture, the line of fence posts marching toward distant hills. Everything looked peaceful, undisturbed. But peace was a fragile thing out here, especially when dangerous men were hunting. I'll take over, he said. You should sleep. Can't. Luke's voice was flat. Every time I close my eyes, I see Victor's face. Hear the gunshot that killed his brother. See Sarah falling in the snow. Jonah understood that kind of haunting. Some images burned themselves into a man's mind so deep that sleep just gave them room to grow. He pulled up another chair and sat beside the boy. Tell me about James Hale, he said. Victor's brother. What kind of man was he? Luke's expression softened slightly. Good, really good. He'd come to the orphanage sometimes, bring books for us to read. He didn't treat us like we were invisible, you know? He'd ask questions, remember our names. When Sarah showed him what Victor was doing, he didn't try to make excuses or tell her to mind her business. He just said, "This ends now," and meant it. Sounds like a man worth remembering. He had a wife, Rebecca, and 2 little kids. Luke's voice went rough. Sarah tried to warn her before we ran, tried to tell her that Victor would come after anyone who knew the truth, but Rebecca didn't believe it. Said her brother-in-law wouldn't hurt family. You think Victor went after them too? I don't know, but a man who'd kill his own brother. Luke finally looked away from the window, meeting Jonah's eyes. There's no bottom to that kind of evil, is there? No, Jonah said honestly. There isn't. They sat in silence for a while, watching the morning creep across the snow. Behind them, the other children began to stir. Quiet murmurs, the soft sounds of people trying not to wake others. The smell of coffee rose from the stove, where Emma had somehow already started breakfast. Sarah woke around midday, more alert this time. Jonah helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back, and brought her water and thin broth that Emma had made from salt pork and vegetables. "The children," Sarah said immediately. "I need to see them. Make sure they're really— I'll bring them in, but you need to eat first. You're weak as a kitten." She wanted to argue. He could see it in the set of her jaw, but her hand shook too much to hold the spoon steady. Jonah ended up feeding her himself, spoonfuls of broth that she swallowed obediently while color slowly returned to her cheeks. "How long have I been out?" she asked between sips. "Day and a half, give or take. You lost a lot of blood. The bullet went clean through, which is good, but the wound was already getting infected when you got here. You're lucky to be alive." "Luck had nothing to do with it. Those children carried me, for miles, through snow." Her eyes went bright with tears she wouldn't let fall. "They should have left me. Would have been safer, faster." "They love you," Jonah said simply. "People don't leave behind the ones they love. Not if there's any other choice." Sarah looked at him then, really looked, her green eyes searching his face like she was trying to figure out what kind of man would take in fugitives and speak about love like it was the simplest thing in the world. "I don't understand you," she said finally. "Why you're helping us? What you get out of this? Maybe I don't get anything. Maybe that's not the point. Everyone wants something." "Your husband teach you that?" Her face went hard. "Ex-husband. And yes, Victor taught me that everyone has a price. Everyone can be bought or scared or broken. That's how he built his empire, finding what people wanted and using it against them." "Well, he's wrong." Jonah set down the empty bowl. "Some people can't be bought. Some people do right because it's right, not because there's profit in it." "I used to believe that," Sarah said quietly. "Before I saw how many people looked away while Victor sold children, how many officials took his money and asked no questions, how many—" She stopped, swallowed hard. How many good people decided that protecting themselves was more important than protecting kids who had no one? Jonah heard the bitterness underneath the words, the kind that came from having your faith in humanity broken piece by piece. "Want to meet the kids who proved you wrong?" he asked. "The ones who carried you through a blizzard instead of leaving you behind?" Her face crumpled. "Yes, please." He brought them in one by one at first, just Lily, the youngest, who climbed onto the bed carefully and wrapped her small arms around Sarah's neck. Then Ruth and Emma, who sat on either side holding her hands. The boys crowded in after, filling the small bedroom with their presence, their relief, their fierce protective love for this woman who'd risked everything for them. "You scared us," Tommy said, his voice accusing and tender at once. "You weren't supposed to get shot." "I know. I'm sorry." Sarah reached out and pulled him close, her hand on the back of his head. "But I'm okay now. We're all okay." "Because of Jonah," Luke said from the doorway. "He took us in, patched you up, gave us food and a place to sleep. Didn't ask for anything." All 7 children turned to look at Jonah with expressions that made his chest tight. He wasn't used to being looked at like that, like he was someone who mattered, someone who'd done something worth doing. "Well," he said gruffly, "couldn't very well leave you all to freeze, could I?" Sarah's eyes met his over the children's heads, and something passed between them, understanding maybe or the beginning of trust. "Thank you," she said again, "for all of it. You already thanked me. Don't need to keep doing it." "I think I do. I think I'll need to thank you every day for the rest of my life, and it still won't be enough." The words hung in the air, significant in ways neither of them was ready to examine. Jonah cleared his throat. "Right. Well, you need rest, and these kids need to let you get it. Out. All of you. Sarah can see you again this evening." They filed out reluctantly, each one touching her hand or her shoulder as they passed, making sure she was real. When the door closed behind them, Sarah lay back against the pillows, exhausted but somehow lighter than before. "They're good kids," Jonah said. "The best. They've been through hell, and they're still kind. Still good. That's rare. So are women who take bullets for other people's children." She smiled slightly. "I'm not special. I couldn't look away anymore. Couldn't pretend I didn't see what Victor was doing, even when it would have been safer, easier. That's exactly what makes you special. Most people choose easy." "And you?" Sarah asked. What do you choose? Jonah thought about his answer, about the 3 years he'd spent alone, choosing isolation over risk, choosing emptiness over the chance of getting hurt again, about how easy it had been to tell himself he was fine when really he'd just been hiding. I'm still figuring that out, he said honestly. But I think maybe I'm done choosing easy. Over the next week, they fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Sarah healed slowly, gaining strength day by day until she could sit up without help, then stand, then walk the length of the room without getting dizzy. The children helped run the ranch, Luke and the older boys learning to care for the horses and cattle, the younger ones feeding chickens and gathering eggs, Emma and the girls managing the house with efficiency that spoke of hard practice. Jonah taught them everything he could think of that might help them survive out here. How to read weather in the sky. How to tell if ice on the well was thick enough to break through. How to shoot straight and reload fast. How to set snares for rabbits and process the meat without waste. Luke absorbed it all like a man dying of thirst, asking questions, practicing until his hands were raw, pushing himself harder than Jonah pushed any of them. The boy was driven by something that went deeper than just wanting to learn. It was the need to be strong enough, prepared enough to protect what was his. Tommy had a gift with the animals that reminded Jonah of himself at that age. The horses gentled under his hands, the cows let him near their calves without fuss. Even the ranch dog, an old collie named Scout, who'd kept to himself since Martha died, started following the boy around like he'd found a new purpose. The girls were quieter, but just as capable. Emma could cook better than Jonah, stretching their supplies into meals that somehow tasted like home. Ruth had a head for numbers, helping Jonah figure his accounts and pointing out where he'd been losing money on feed purchases. And little Lily, despite everything she'd been through, still found joy in small things, the way snow sparkled in sunlight, the sound of Scout's tail thumping, the taste of fresh bread with butter. Sarah watched it all from the bedroom window at first, then from the main room as she grew stronger. Jonah caught her looking at the children with an expression he couldn't quite name, pride and love and fear all mixed together, fear that this peace couldn't last, that Victor would find them and tear it all apart. He was right to be watching for that fear. 2 weeks after Sarah and the children arrived, Ben came running in from the barn, his face pale. "Riders," he gasped. "Coming from the east, 3 of them." Jonah's blood went cold. "Luke, get the children inside. Emma, take the girls to the bedroom and stay there. Sarah, can you shoot?" She was already moving despite her healing wound, reaching for one of the rifles they kept loaded by the door. "Yes." "Then get to the window. Don't shoot unless I give the signal." He looked at Luke. "You stay with your brothers. If anything happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you," Luke said fiercely. "We won't let it." There wasn't time to argue. Jonah grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. The 3 riders were close enough now that he could see they weren't Victor's men. Wrong build, wrong bearing. As they drew nearer, he recognized the leader, Marcus Webb, the town sheriff, and with him 2 deputies Jonah knew by sight, if not by name. "Marcus," Jonah called out, forcing his voice steady. "Little far from town, aren't you?" The sheriff reined in his horse at the edge of the porch, his weathered face unreadable. "Jonah, got a report you might have some visitors. Thought I'd ride out and check." "Who reported what?" "Ben Thompson was passing through last week, said he saw what looked like a whole passel of kids out by your woodpile. Said it seemed strange, you being alone all this time." Marcus shifted in his saddle, his eyes scanning the ranch. "You got kids here, Jonah?" There was no point lying. The tracks in the snow would tell the story anyway. "I do." "How many?" 7. Marcus's eyebrows rose. 7. That's a lot of children to just show up out of nowhere. "They needed help. I gave it." "Uh-huh." The sheriff's gaze sharpened. "You wouldn't happen to have a woman with them, would you? Dark hair, green eyes, about 30 years old?" Jonah kept his face blank. "Why?" "Because there's a warrant out for a Sarah Hale. Murder charge out of Denver. Word is she kidnapped 7 children from a respectable orphanage and ran. There's a substantial reward for information leading to her capture." Behind him, Jonah heard the soft click of Sarah cocking the rifle. He didn't turn around, didn't take his eyes off Marcus. What do you know about Victor Hale? The question seemed to catch the sheriff off guard. Rich man, runs a children's foundation. Why? Because he's the one who should have a warrant out for him. He's been buying and selling those kids like livestock. His brother found out and tried to stop him, so Victor put a bullet in him and blamed Sarah for it. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Those children in my house can testify to it. They saw the whole thing. Marcus looked troubled, his hand resting on his saddle horn. Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it's not, you're harboring a fugitive. That puts you on the wrong side of the law, Jonah. Then I guess I'm on the wrong side of the law. Jonah's grip tightened on his rifle. Because I'm not turning her over. Not her, not the kids, not to you, not to Victor Hale, not to anyone. Jonah? Marcus, you've known me for 8 years. Have I ever lied to you? Ever given you reason to doubt my word? The sheriff's jaw worked. No? Then believe me now. That woman saved those children from a man who was selling them to mines and railroads and God knows where else. She's got evidence, records, proof of what Victor's been doing. And the only reason she's wanted for murder is because Victor's got enough money and power to buy witnesses and judges. You got this proof? Sarah does. Written records, names, dates, sales receipts, everything. Marcus sat back in his saddle, clearly torn. Behind him, the 2 deputies exchanged glances. Finally, the sheriff spoke. I'd like to talk to her, hear her side of things. Jonah hesitated, weighing the risk. Then Sarah's voice came from behind him, strong, despite the pain he knew she was in. Let him come in, Jonah. If he's willing to listen, I'm willing to talk. They gathered in the main room, Marcus, Jonah, Sarah, and Luke, who refused to leave her side. The other children stayed in the bedroom with Emma standing guard, but Jonah could feel them listening through the thin walls. Sarah sat in the chair by the fire, her face pale, but her voice steady as she told her story. Everything. How she'd come to work for the foundation thinking it was legitimate charity. How she'd started noticing discrepancies in the books. How children would arrive and then disappear with no record of adoption. How she'd begun her own investigation, writing down everything she could find. James Hale was an honest man, she said. When I showed him what I'd discovered, he believed me immediately. He told Victor he was going to the authorities, and Victor shot him. I was in the next room. The children were with me. We all heard it. Then Victor came out, Luke added, his young voice hard as stone. Told us if we ever said a word, he'd sell every one of us to places we'd never come back from. Said he owned us, and he could do whatever he wanted. Marcus listened without interrupting, his weathered face growing darker as the story unfolded. When they finished, he sat silent for a long moment. You got these records? He finally asked. Sarah reached into her coat, the same one she'd been wearing when she collapsed, now clean and mended, and pulled out a small leather journal. Everything's here. 3 years of sales, over 100 children, names, ages, where they were sent, how much Victor charged for them. The sheriff took the journal and paged through it, his expression growing grimmer with each entry. This is Jesus. This is monstrous. That's why we ran, Sarah said. That's why I took the children and left Denver the night before my trial. Because I knew Victor would make sure I hung for James's murder, and then there'd be no one left to stop him. No one who knew what he was doing to those kids. Marcus closed the journal carefully, like it might burn him. If this is all true, it is true, Luke said fiercely. Every word. Then you're right. Victor Hale's the one who should be in chains, not you. The sheriff looked at Jonah. But that doesn't change the fact that there's legal warrants out. Doesn't matter if they're based on lies. They're still legal until a judge says otherwise. So what are you going to do? Jonah asked. Marcus stood, tucking the journal into his coat. I'm going to ride back to town and send some telegrams. Get this information to people who might actually do something about it. Federal marshals, maybe. Someone outside Victor Hale's sphere of influence. He looked at Sarah. But I'm also going to tell folks I rode out here and didn't find anything. Far as I'm concerned, you're not here. None of you are. Relief washed through the room so powerfully that Lily started crying in the next room, the sound muffled through the door. Why? Sarah whispered. Why would you risk helping us? Marcus's face softened. Because I've got a daughter about your age, ma'am. And if she came to me with a story like this, I'd hope someone would believe her, would stand up for her. He settled his hat back on his head. Besides, I've met Victor Hale. Come through town a few times on business. Something about him always struck me wrong. Too smooth, too sure of himself. The kind of man who thinks money makes him untouchable. It usually does, Sarah said bitterly. Not in Montana. Out here, a man's judged by his character, not his bank account. And kidnapping and selling children? Marcus shook his head. That kind of evil doesn't get a pass, no matter how rich you are. He headed for the door, then paused. Jonah, you keep them safe. Keep your eyes open. If Victor figures out where they are, and he will, eventually. He won't come alone, and he won't come friendly. I know. You got enough ammunition? For now? I'll send some out, and maybe a few supplies. Winter's going to get worse before it gets better. Marcus tipped his hat to Sarah. Ma'am, I hope this works out for you, for all of you. When he was gone, the children spilled out of the bedroom, surrounding Sarah with questions and relief and the simple need to be near her. Jonah watched from the doorway as she held them, reassured them, her hands gentle on their heads, even as pain flickered across her face from her healing wound. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Jonah sat by the fire. She was stronger now, able to move around without help, though she still tired easily. The lamplight caught in her dark hair, turned her eyes to emerald. Do you think Marcus will really help? She asked quietly. I think he'll try. Whether it'll be enough? Jonah shrugged. Hard to say. Victor's got a lot of power. So we wait. We wait, and we prepare. Sarah looked at the children sleeping peacefully around the room, at the home they'd built in this stranger's house over the course of 2 weeks. I never meant to bring this to your door, she said. This danger, this trouble. You should have turned us away. Probably. But I didn't, and I'm not going to. Even if it costs you everything? Jonah thought about that. About his ranch, his peaceful solitude, the safe, quiet life he'd built after Martha died. About what he stood to lose if Victor came with enough men and enough guns. Then he looked at the children. At Luke, who'd learned to smile again over the past 2 weeks. At Tommy, who'd stopped flinching when someone moved too fast. At little Lily, who'd started singing while she gathered eggs, her voice sweet and clear in the cold morning air. Some things are worth the cost, he said simply. Sarah's eyes shimmered with tears. I don't know how to thank you. Don't need thanks. Just tell me one thing. When this is over, when Victor's dealt with and you're free, what then? What do you want? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I want a place where those children are safe, where they can be kids again instead of property or commodities or pawns. I want them to have a chance at normal lives, at happiness. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I want them to have what Victor stole from them. And what about you? What do you want for yourself? Sarah looked at him then, and something in her expression made his heart stutter. I want to stop running. I want to wake up without fear. I want... She trailed off, seeming to struggle with the words. I want a home. A real one. Not just a place to hide, but somewhere that's mine. Ours. Where we belong. You belong here, Jonah said before he could stop himself. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to carry. Sarah's breath caught, her eyes widening slightly. Jonah, I mean it. You and the kids. This place has been dead since Martha passed, but you all brought it back to life, made it feel like a home again instead of just a house I'm living in. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other, but I also know that some things you just feel in your bones are right, and this feels right. A tear slid down her cheek. You could die because of us. Victor won't just give up. He'll come, and when he does, then we'll face him, together, all of us. Jonah reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly. I lost my wife. Lost the future we'd planned. Spent 3 years telling myself I was better off alone. But I was wrong. We're not meant to be alone. We're meant to fight for each other, to build something worth protecting. Sarah turned her hand in his, gripping tight like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. I'm scared, she whispered. Not for me. For them. For you. I couldn't bear it if... I know. But fear's just proof we've got something worth losing, and I'd rather fight scared than give up without trying." They sat like that for a while, hands clasped, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the house. Inside, the children slept safe and warm. And two people who'd both lost everything began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd found something worth keeping. Whatever storm was coming, they'd face it together. They had to, because running was over and hiding had ended. This was where they stood. The storm Marcus had warned about arrived 3 days later with a fury that turned the world white. Snow fell so thick that Jonah couldn't see the barn from the porch, and the wind screamed like something alive and angry. They huddled inside, keeping the fires burning high, rationing supplies that would have to last until the weather broke. It was on the 4th day of the blizzard, when the wind finally started to ease, that they heard the horses. Luke spotted them first, his post by the window as vigilant as ever. "Riders," he said, his voice cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. "A lot of them." Jonah was at the window in 3 strides. Through the thinning snow he could see them, at least 15 men, maybe more, spread out in a loose line across his land. And at the center, on a black horse that looked too fine for ranch country, sat a man in an expensive coat with silver buttons that caught the weak sunlight. Victor Hale had found them. "Sarah, get the children to the root cellar," Jonah said, his voice calm despite the ice spreading through his veins. "Luke, you go with them." "No." Sarah was already loading rifles, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I'm not hiding while you face him alone." "Sarah, he's here for me, Jonah. For us. I'm not letting you fight this battle by yourself." She met his gaze, fierce and unbreakable. "We stand together, or we don't stand at all." There wasn't time to argue. The riders were close enough now that Jonah could see Victor's face, handsome in a cold, calculated way, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. The men flanking him were armed, rifles visible across their saddles, pistols at their hips. "Emma, take the young ones to the cellar anyway," Jonah said. "Bar the door from inside and don't come out until one of us tells you it's safe." Emma nodded, her face pale but determined. She gathered Ruth, Lily, Sam, and David, herding them toward the trap door in the kitchen floor. Tommy and Ben stayed with Luke, each boy holding a rifle they'd been practicing with for weeks. "You boys know how to shoot," Jonah said quietly, "but knowing how and having to do it are different things. If it comes to that—" "We know," Luke interrupted. "We've already decided. We're not going back to him. None of us are. Whatever it takes." The certainty in the boy's voice was terrible and beautiful at once. These children had been forced to grow up too fast, to make choices no child should have to make. But they'd made them anyway, and they'd stand by them. Jonah stepped out onto the porch, Sarah beside him, the boys fanning out behind them. The cold bit through his coat, but he barely felt it. All his attention was on the man riding toward his home with a small army at his back. Victor stopped his horse 20 feet from the porch, close enough to talk without shouting. Up close, he was everything Sarah had described. Polished, confident, radiating the kind of power that came from always getting what he wanted. "Mr. Carter, I presume," Victor said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I apologize for the intrusion. I'm Victor Hale, and I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Nothing here belongs to you," Jonah replied evenly. Victor's smile widened, though his eyes stayed cold. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. That woman beside you is wanted for murder, and those children she kidnapped from my lawful care need to be returned to proper supervision." "Your lawful care?" Sarah's voice rang out, sharp with contempt. "Is that what you call selling children to mining companies? To railroads? To anyone willing to pay your price?" "Careful, Sarah. Slander is a serious charge." Victor's gaze slid to her, and Jonah saw something dark flicker in those cold eyes. Rage, barely controlled. "I've been very patient with you, gave you chances to come to your senses, to understand that fighting me was futile. But you just kept pushing, kept interfering, and then you murdered my brother." "You murdered James," she shot back. "You put a bullet in him because he was going to expose what you've been doing, and these children witnessed it, all of them." Victor laughed, the sound brittle and harsh. "The testimony of orphans? Against a respected businessman? Please, no court would ever believe them over me." "Sheriff Webb believed them," Jonah said. Took Sarah's evidence and sent it to the federal marshals. They're very interested in your business practices, Mr. Hale. For the first time, something like uncertainty crossed Victor's face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by that cold smile. Marcus Webb is a small-town sheriff with no jurisdiction in Denver, and the federal marshals will find that my records are impeccable. I've been very careful. You made mistakes, Sarah said. I documented every single one. Every child you sold, every falsified adoption record, every bribe you paid to keep officials quiet. It's all written down, and it's already in the hands of people who can't be bought. Victor's jaw tightened. Then I suppose we have nothing more to discuss. Mr. Carter, I'm authorized by the state of Colorado to retrieve a fugitive and return her for trial. I'm also authorized to recover property, those children, stolen from my institution. You can hand them over peacefully, or my men can take them by force. Your choice. Here's my choice, Jonah said, raising his rifle to rest across his chest. You turn around and ride off my land. You don't come back. You don't send more men. You leave these people alone. Or what? You'll shoot me? Victor's smile turned vicious. I have 15 armed men with me, Mr. Carter. You have a wounded woman and some children. The mathematics aren't in your favor. Maybe not, but the first bullet goes through you. That's a guarantee. Jonah's voice was flat, matter of fact. You can have your men kill me after, but you won't be around to enjoy it. The standoff held, tension stretched so tight it felt like the air itself might crack. Behind Victor, his men shifted uneasily. They'd signed on for intimidation, maybe some rough justice. But facing down a man willing to die to protect what was his, that was different math entirely. Then one of Victor's men spoke up, his voice uncertain. Mr. Hale, maybe we should wait for the law to sort this out. Let the marshals— The law is what I say it is, Victor snapped. He turned back to Jonah, all pretense of civility gone. You're making a mistake. A fatal one. I always get what's mine. Always. And if you stand in my way— The shot cracked through the cold air like thunder. For a frozen moment, nobody moved. Then Victor's horse reared, screaming, and chaos erupted. The men behind Victor scattered, some reaching for their weapons, others trying to control panicked horses. Jonah's eyes snapped to the source of the shot, the ridge above his eastern pasture where a figure stood with a rifle. Sheriff Marcus Webb. Next shot's not a warning, Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the snow. It goes through the first man who draws a weapon. Now, Mr. Hale, I believe Mr. Carter told you to leave his property. Victor fought his horse back under control, his face twisted with rage. You're interfering with legal business, Sheriff. That's a crime. So's trespassing. So's threatening citizens. And from where I'm standing, you're doing both. Marcus started down the ridge, his rifle never wavering from Victor's chest. I got a very interesting response to those telegrams I sent. Turns out the federal marshals have been building a case against you for months. They're real interested in those records Miss Hale provided. Those records prove nothing. She's a liar and a murderer. Funny thing about that murder charge, Marcus continued closer now. Federal investigators talked to some of your employees, ones who weren't on your payroll anymore. Got some real interesting testimony about what happened the night James Hale died, about who was actually holding the gun. Victor's face had gone white. Lies. All lies. We'll let a jury decide that. In the meantime, there's a federal warrant being issued for your arrest. Wire came through this morning. Marcus smiled, cold and satisfied. You're under arrest, Mr. Hale, for fraud, kidnapping, child trafficking, and the murder of your brother James. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Victor's men were already backing away, hands raised, wanting no part of this. Whatever loyalty he'd bought from them evaporated the moment federal charges came into play. You can't do this, Victor said, but his voice had lost its certainty. I have lawyers, money, influence. You're a nobody sheriff in a nothing town. You can't— Actually, I can. And I am. Marcus gestured to his deputies, who'd appeared from the barn, rifles ready. Now you're going to dismount real slow and put your hands where I can see them. Your men are going to ride back to town ahead of us, and if anyone makes trouble, Mr. Carter has my permission to shoot first and ask questions after. Victor looked at Jonah, at Sarah, at the children standing firm on the porch, looked at his men already retreating, looked at the sheriff, who'd just destroyed his careful empire with a handful of telegrams and the truth he'd spent years trying to bury. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You think one arrest will stop me? I'll be out before the week's done. I'll come back with more men, better lawyers, and I'll burn this place to the ground. I'll make sure every one of you pays for this." "Keep talking," Marcus said. "Just gives me more charges to add." But Victor wasn't done. He looked at Sarah, and the hatred in his eyes was so pure it was almost physical. "You destroyed everything. My reputation, my business, my life. And for what? For these worthless children? For some pathetic idea of justice?" Sarah stepped forward, and Jonah saw something in her face he'd never seen before. Not anger, not fear, but pity. "I didn't destroy you, Victor. You destroyed yourself the moment you decided that money mattered more than human life. The moment you looked at children and saw profit instead of people. What I did was make sure you couldn't hurt anyone else." "You self-righteous—" "Enough," Marcus interrupted. "One more word and I'll gag you. Get off the horse. Now." Victor dismounted, movements jerky with rage. The deputies moved in, securing his hands behind his back with iron cuffs that looked too heavy for his expensive suit. He stood there, diminished somehow, all his power and polish stripped away to reveal the small, cruel man underneath. As they led him toward the horses, he turned back one last time. "The children are still mine, legally. I have the papers." "Those papers are forgeries," Marcus said. "Federal marshals already confirmed it. You never legally adopted or gained guardianship of any of those kids. You just took them and made up documents to suit yourself." He looked at Sarah. "Far as the law's concerned, Miss Hale has more right to them than you ever did. She's the one who actually cared about their welfare." The last bit of color drained from Victor's face. He'd lost, completely. His empire was crumbling, his crimes exposed, his power broken. And the woman he'd tried to destroy was standing free while he was being led away in chains. "This isn't justice," he spat. This is exactly justice," Luke called out from the porch, his young voice clear and strong. "This is you finally getting what you deserve for killing your brother and selling us like we were nothing. And I hope you rot in prison for it." Victor lunged toward the porch, but the deputies held him back. Marcus shook his head, disgust clear on his weathered face. "Get him out of here. I've seen enough." They hauled Victor onto his horse, hands still cuffed behind his back, and started the long ride to town. His men had already scattered, wanting no association with a man facing federal charges. Within minutes, the only sound was wind through the pines and the fading hoofbeats of horses carrying a monster away from the children he'd tormented. Sarah's knees gave out. Jonah caught her before she hit the ground, wrapping his arms around her as 3 weeks of fear and pain and desperate hope finally broke through her iron control. She sobbed into his chest, her whole body shaking, while the children rushed from the porch to surround them both. They stood like that in the snow, a knot of people holding each other while the weight of what had just happened settled over them. Victor was gone. The threat that had chased them across state lines, that had stolen their sleep and their peace, was finally ended. Marcus approached slowly, giving them space to process. When Sarah finally lifted her head, eyes red but clear, he offered a gentle smile. "The federal marshals want you to testify at the trial," he said. "You and the children. With your evidence and their testimony, Victor Hale won't see the outside of a prison cell for the rest of his life." "When?" Sarah's voice was hoarse. "Month or 2, most likely. They're building an airtight case. Want to make sure there's no chance of him slipping through on technicalities." Marcus looked at the children. "In the meantime, you'll need somewhere to stay, somewhere safe." "They're staying here," Jonah said firmly. "All of them, for as long as they need." Marcus nodded like he'd expected nothing less. "Figured you'd say that. I'll make sure it's official. Temporary guardianship for Miss Hale until the custody situation gets sorted out properly. That work for you?" Sarah looked up at Jonah, something fragile and hopeful in her eyes. "Is that really okay? We've already imposed so much." "It's not imposing if I'm asking you to stay." Jonah's arms tightened around her slightly. "This is your home now, yours and theirs, for as long as you want it." Lily tugged on Sarah's coat. "Does that mean we don't have to leave? We can really stay?" Sarah knelt down despite the pain it caused her healing wound, gathering the little girl into her arms. "We can really stay, sweetheart. All of us. We're safe now." The children erupted in a chaos of relief and joy, hugging each other, hugging Sarah and Jonah. Some crying, some laughing, all of them finally allowing themselves to believe that the nightmare was over. Even Luke, who'd held himself so rigidly controlled for so long, let tears stream down his face as Tommy and Ben pulled him into a fierce embrace. Emma emerged from the root cellar with the younger children, and Marcus explained what had happened. More tears, more embraces, the kind of cathartic release that came when fear that had been held too long finally had permission to break. Marcus stayed for coffee, warming himself by the fire while the children gradually calmed down and started asking questions. How long would Victor be in prison? What would happen to the other children he'd sold? Could they really never come after them again? The sheriff answered each question patiently, honestly, not sugarcoating the difficulties ahead, but making clear that the worst was behind them. When he finally stood to leave, Sarah stopped him at the door. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing us, for helping when you had every reason to walk away." Marcus settled his hat on his head. "Miss Hale, I've been sheriffing for 20 years. I've learned to tell when someone's lying and when they're telling the hardest truth they've ever had to speak. You were telling the truth. Rest was just doing my job. Still, thank you." He tipped his hat and mounted his horse, riding off into the afternoon with a wave. When he disappeared over the ridge, Jonah closed the door and turned to find 7 children and one remarkable woman looking at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. "What?" he asked. "You said this is our home," Ruth said softly. "Did you mean it?" Jonah looked around the room, at the bedrolls still scattered from sleep, at the breakfast dishes waiting to be washed, at the rifles leaning by the door and the children's coats hanging on pegs, at all the signs of life that had transformed his empty house into something that mattered. "I meant it," he said, "every word." That night, they celebrated with the last of Jonah's stored apples, baked into pies that filled the house with the smell of cinnamon and sugar. The children ate until they were stuffed, laughing and talking over each other with the kind of freedom that came from knowing they were finally, truly safe. Later, after the young ones had fallen asleep and the older children were drowsing by the fire, Sarah and Jonah found themselves alone on the porch again. The sky had cleared, stars brilliant and cold overhead, the world washed clean by snow. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," Sarah said quietly, "that this is all some dream and I'll open my eyes to find Victor standing over me with that gun. It's real. He's gone. You're safe." "We're safe," she corrected, "all of us. Because of you." She turned to face him, her breath misting in the cold air. "You gave us everything, Jonah. Your home, your protection, your trust. You put yourself in danger for people you'd never met. Why?" Jonah thought about all the answers he could give, about duty, about what was right, about not being able to stand by while children suffered. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than any of that. "Because the moment I saw you in that snow, dying to save those kids, I knew you were someone worth fighting for. Because in 2 weeks, you and those children gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. Purpose. Family. A reason to care about tomorrow." He reached out and took her hand, her fingers cold even through her gloves. "Because you made me remember what it feels like to be alive instead of just surviving." Sarah's eyes shimmered with tears. "I don't deserve you. You survived a man who tried to destroy you, saved 7 children at the cost of everything you had, walked through a blizzard with a bullet in you because giving up would have meant those kids went back to hell." Jonah's voice was rough with emotion. "If anyone doesn't deserve someone, Sarah, it's me not deserving you." She laughed, the sound watery but genuine. "Then I guess we're even. I guess we are." They stood in the cold, hands clasped, watching stars wheel overhead. Inside, 7 children slept peacefully for the first time in their lives, dreaming of a future that was finally, impossibly real. And 2 people who'd both lost everything stood together, building something new from the ashes of what had been. Tomorrow would bring challenges, a trial to prepare for, legal custody to sort out, the hard work of turning temporary refuge into permanent home. But tonight, under a sky full of stars and a silence broken only by wind through pines, they had peace. They had each other. They had won. The next morning brought a visitor neither of them expected. Rebecca Hale arrived in a small carriage, her 2 children bundled against the cold beside her. She looked older than her years, grief etched into every line of her face, but her eyes were clear and determined. Sarah met her at the door, uncertain. This was James's widow, the woman who hadn't believed Victor could be dangerous, whose husband had died trying to stop a monster. "Mrs. Hale," Sarah began, "I'm so sorry." "Don't!" Rebecca held up a hand, her voice shaking. "Don't apologize. You tried to warn me, tried to tell me what Victor was. And I didn't listen." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "James is dead because I wouldn't believe my brother-in-law could be evil. And you nearly died trying to save children I told myself weren't my problem. You couldn't have known. I should have. I should have looked harder, questioned more, cared about those children Victor claimed to be helping." Rebecca stepped forward. "Sarah, I came to tell you that I'm going to testify at the trial. I'm going to tell the jury everything James told me the night before he died, every suspicion he had, every piece of evidence he found. I won't let Victor twist the truth anymore." Sarah pulled the other woman into an embrace, both of them crying now. Behind them, Jonah gathered the children and gave the women space to grieve together, to share the weight of loss and the determination to make it mean something. When they finally separated, Rebecca looked at the children peeking from behind Jonah. "Are these the ones you saved?" "Yes." Rebecca knelt down, her own children clinging to her skirts. "I'm Rebecca Hale, James's wife. Your Uncle James loved you all very much. He died trying to give you the lives you deserved. And I promise you, I'm going to make sure his death meant something. I'm going to make sure Victor pays for what he did." Luke stepped forward, his young face solemn. "Your husband was a good man, ma'am. We all knew it. And we're sorry he's gone." "Thank you," Rebecca whispered. "That means more than you know." She stayed for lunch, and the children gradually warmed to her, sensing her genuine remorse and determination to make things right. By the time she left, they'd promised to write, to stay in touch, to face the trial together. As her carriage disappeared down the snow-covered road, Sarah leaned against Jonah's shoulder. "It's really happening," she said. "Justice, truth, everything we fought for." "It is." "I'm scared." "Me too. But we'll face it together." "Together," Sarah repeated, like the word was a promise and a prayer all at once. And standing on the porch of a ranch that had become home, surrounded by children who'd become family, they watched the sun set on a day that had changed everything. The storm had passed. The battle had been won. Now came the hard work of healing. But they were ready. Together, they were ready for anything. The weeks between Victor's arrest and the trial moved with the strange duality of time that both crawled and flew. Winter deepened its grip on Montana, snow piling high against the barn walls, ice forming crystalline patterns on the windows. Inside the ranch house, life settled into rhythms that felt almost normal. Chores and lessons, meals shared around the table, evenings by the fire where the children finally learned what it meant to simply be children. Sarah's wound healed, leaving a scar that she told Jonah she'd wear with pride. "A reminder," she said one morning as he changed the bandage for what would be the last time, "that I fought for something that mattered, that I didn't just survive, I chose to stand." The legal preparations consumed her attention during daylight hours. Federal prosecutors arrived from Denver, serious men in dark suits who filled the dining table with documents and asked questions that forced her to relive every terrible moment. They were thorough, methodical, building their case like masons laying stones, each piece of evidence placed with careful precision. "Your testimony will be crucial," the lead prosecutor told her on a gray February afternoon. "Victor Hale's lawyers are the best money can buy. They'll try to discredit you, paint you as a scorned employee seeking revenge. We need you to be unshakable." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. "I've been unshakable since the moment I watched him murder his brother. I won't falter now." "Good. Because they'll come at you hard. They'll dig into your past, twist your words, make you seem unstable or vindictive. Can you handle that?" "I can handle anything if it means those children get justice." The prosecutor's stern face softened slightly. "I believe you can. I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone with your kind of steel. Victor Hale made a mistake when he underestimated you. After the prosecutors left, Jonah found Sarah standing at the bedroom window, staring out at nothing. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, feeling the tension in her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. "All the children Victor sold before I started keeping records. The ones I couldn't save. The ones whose names I don't even know." Her voice cracked. "What happens to them? Even if we win, even if Victor spends the rest of his life in prison, those children are still out there, still suffering." The prosecutors said they're investigating every transaction they can find, tracking down the children, bringing charges against the people who bought them. It's not fast, but it's happening. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. Jonah turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her arms. "You saved 7 lives, Sarah. 7 children who would have been sold and scattered and lost. That's not nothing. That's everything." Tears slipped down her cheeks. Tommy's brother Peter is still out there somewhere. What if we never find him? What if... Then we keep looking. After the trial, when things settle, we hire investigators. We use Victor's own records to track every child. We don't stop until we've found every single one we can. He wiped her tears with his thumb. "You didn't start this fight to save some of them. You started it to save all of them, and we're going to finish what you started." She leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "Pretty sure I'm the lucky one. I was half dead inside before you showed up. You brought me back to life." They stood like that until Sarah's breathing steadied, until the weight of impossible responsibility eased enough to bear. Outside, they could hear the children playing in the snow, Luke and the older boys having a snowball fight, the girls building something that looked like it wanted to be a fort, their laughter carrying on the cold air like bells. "They're happy," Sarah said softly. "Really happy. I can hear it in their voices. They feel safe. Maybe for the first time ever. Because of you. Because you gave them a home." "We gave them a home," Jonah corrected. "You and me. Together." The word hung between them, weighted with meaning that had been building since the night Victor was arrested. They'd been living as a family, functioning as partners, but neither had spoken aloud what was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone around them. Sarah pulled back slightly, looking up at him with those green eyes that had haunted his dreams since the first moment he'd seen her in the snow. "Jonah, I need to tell you something. Before the trial, before everything gets complicated again." "I'm listening." "I love you." The words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back too long. "I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other. I know I'm damaged and complicated, and I come with 7 children and a mountain of legal trouble. But I love you, and I needed you to know that before I stand up in that courtroom, because if something goes wrong..." He kissed her, just leaned down and kissed her with all the feeling he'd been keeping carefully controlled for weeks. She made a small sound of surprise that melted into something else, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a shifting world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jonah rested his forehead against hers. "Nothing's going wrong. You're going to testify. Victor's going to be convicted, and then you and I and those 7 kids are going to build a life here, a real life, together." "You're so certain." "I am. Because I love you too, Sarah Hale. Loved you from the moment you gripped my wrist in the snow and told me to save the children. Loved you more every day since, watching you heal and fight and refuse to break no matter what the world threw at you." He pulled back enough to see her face. "You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see the strongest person I've ever met. I see the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. I see home." She was crying again, but these tears were different, the kind that came from joy too big to contain. "I never thought I'd have this, never thought I deserved it. You deserve everything good this world has to offer, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." They kissed again, softer this time, sealing promises that didn't need words. Outside, one of the children called for Sarah, and they broke apart laughing, the moment both complete and just beginning. That night, Jonah asked Luke to take the children to the barn to check on the horses, giving him a few minutes alone with Sarah. When they were gone, he went to the chest where he kept his most precious belongings and pulled out a small wooden box. "Martha gave this to me the day we got married," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. She said it wasn't much, but it was hers and she wanted me to have it. Made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd find someone else to love. Someone who'd make me happy again. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Jonah, I don't want to replace her. She'll always be part of my story, part of who I am, but she's gone, and you're here, and I think she'd be glad that I found you. He took Sarah's hand, his heart pounding. I'm not asking you to marry me right now, not with the trial coming, not with everything still uncertain, but I'm asking you to think about it, to consider making this permanent, me, you, and 7 kids who need us both. Sarah looked at the ring, tears streaming freely now. I don't need to think about it, yes. Whenever you're ready to ask properly, the answer is yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. They stayed like that, hands clasped, until the children came thundering back inside, snow-covered and ravenous for dinner. Emma noticed the ring first. Her eyes went wide, then filled with tears. Are you getting married? 7 pairs of eyes locked onto Sarah and Jonah. The question hung in the sudden silence, huge and terrifying and wonderful. Eventually, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly, if that's okay with all of you, if you want... She didn't get to finish. The children swarmed them, all talking at once, hugging and crying and laughing. Lily grabbed Jonah's hand and Sarah's hand and pressed them together. Does this mean you're our mama and papa now? Sarah knelt down, gathering the little girl close. Do you want us to be? More than anything, Lily whispered. Luke stood slightly apart, his expression complex. When the younger children finally calmed down, he spoke quietly. You really want us? All of us? Even knowing how much trouble we've been? Jonah crossed to the boy and put a hand on his shoulder. Luke, you and your brothers and sisters aren't trouble. You're family. Have been since the day you walked onto this ranch. This just makes it official. But we're not yours. Not really. We're just orphans that Sarah saved. You're ours, Sarah said firmly. Blood doesn't make family. Love does. Choice does. And we're choosing you. All of you. Forever. The boy's composure finally cracked. He threw his arms around Sarah, then Jonah, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd been holding back for far too long. The other children piled on, and they stood like that in the middle of the kitchen, a tangle of arms and tears and fierce, protective love. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Jonah made plans. After the trial, they'd make the adoption legal, all 7 children officially theirs. They'd expand the house, add bedrooms, maybe build a schoolroom where Emma could teach the younger ones. They'd hire hands to help with the ranch, turn it into something prosperous enough to support their growing family. I want to keep fighting for the other children, Sarah said. The ones Victor sold. I want to find them, help them, make sure they get the justice they deserve. Then that's what we'll do. Together. It could take years. It could cost everything we have. Then it takes years and costs everything. Some things are worth it. Jonah laced his fingers through hers, the ring catching lamplight. Besides, you taught me that standing aside and letting evil win isn't living. It's just existing. I'm done existing. The trial was set for early March in Denver. They'd have to travel, all of them, back to the city where Victor's power had seemed absolute. The prosecutors wanted the children there, ready to testify if needed, though they hoped Sarah's evidence and Rebecca Hale's testimony would be enough to convict without putting the young ones through that ordeal. The night before they left, Jonah stood on the porch watching the stars. Montana was beautiful in late winter, the world frozen and clean, the sky so clear it felt like you could see forever. He'd lived here for 8 years, most of them alone, and he'd thought he'd known what home felt like. But home wasn't a place. It was the woman sleeping in his bed, her hand resting on the spot where a bullet had nearly stolen her life. It was 7 children dreaming peacefully in the next room, finally safe enough to sleep without nightmares. It was the family they'd all chosen, cobbled together from broken pieces and made whole by love and stubborn determination. Sarah emerged wrapped in a quilt and settled beside him. Couldn't sleep? Too much thinking. About tomorrow? About everything. About how much has changed in 2 months. How different my life is now. He pulled her close, feeling her warmth against his side. Are you scared? Terrified, she admitted. but also ready. I've been running from Victor for so long, running from his power, his violence, his ability to twist truth into lies. Tomorrow I stop running. Tomorrow I stand up in front of the world and tell the truth, no matter what it costs me. You won't be alone. I'll be right there with you. I know. That's the only reason I can do this. She looked up at him, her face pale but determined in the starlight. Promise me something, Jonah. If things go wrong, if somehow Victor's lawyers manage to turn this around, they won't. But if they do, promise me you'll take care of the children, that you'll keep them safe, give them the life they deserve. Promise me. Sarah, please. I need to know they'll be okay, no matter what happens to me. Jonah turned her to face him fully, his hands on her shoulders. Nothing is going to happen to you. We have evidence, witnesses, federal prosecutors who've spent months building an airtight case. Victor Hale is going to prison for the rest of his life, and you're going to walk out of that courtroom free and clear. You can't know that. I know that justice matters. I know that truth has power. And I know that you didn't survive everything you've survived just to lose now. He kissed her forehead, gentle and fierce at once. But yes, I promise. If something goes wrong, I'll take care of them. I'll love them and protect them and make sure they know how brave their mother was. Stepmother, she corrected with a small smile. Mother, he insisted. You're more their mother than most women who give birth. You chose them, fought for them, bled for them. That makes you their mother in every way that counts. They stood together in the cold, drawing strength from each other until the wind drove them back inside. Tomorrow they'd face the trial that would determine all their futures. Tomorrow Sarah would stand against the man who'd tried to destroy her and tell the truth that could set them all free. But tonight, they had peace. They had each other. They had a family worth fighting for. And sometimes that was enough. The journey to Denver took 3 days by train. The children pressed against windows, watching the landscape change from Montana's frozen vastness to Colorado's stark beauty. They stayed in a hotel the prosecutors had arranged, 2 rooms with connecting doors, and Sarah barely slept. Every noise in the hallway made her jump, convinced Victor had somehow escaped and come to finish what he started. On the morning of the trial, she stood in front of the mirror in clothes Rebecca Hale had sent. A simple but dignified dress in dark blue, her hair pulled back severely, her face pale but composed. She looked like what she was, a woman ready to face her demons. Jonah came up behind her, straightening his own collar. He'd borrowed a suit from Marcus Webb, and he looked uncomfortable but determined. You ready? No? But I'm doing it anyway. The courthouse was an imposing building of granite and marble, its columns reaching toward a gray sky that threatened snow. People crowded the steps, reporters, curiosity seekers, people who'd read about the case in newspapers and come to watch justice unfold. Sarah gripped Jonah's hand as they climbed those steps, the children behind them, Rebecca Hale and her own children joining them at the top. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Sarah saw Victor before he saw her, sitting at the defense table between 2 lawyers in expensive suits, his face calm and confident despite the chains on his wrists. He looked like a man who believed money and power could still save him. Then he turned and their eyes met. For just a moment, his mask slipped. She saw rage there and fear and the desperate calculation of a man watching his empire crumble. Then the mask was back, that cold smile fixed in place. All rise, the bailiff called. The Honorable Judge Martin Hendricks presiding. The judge was an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He took his seat, surveyed the packed courtroom, and brought his gavel down once. In the matter of the United States versus Victor Hale, on charges of fraud, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, and first-degree murder. How does the defendant plead? Victor's lead lawyer stood, his voice smooth and practiced. Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor. Mr. Hale is an upstanding citizen who has devoted his life to helping orphaned children. These charges are based on fabricated evidence from a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge for a personal slight. The prosecutor rose, his voice hard as iron. The evidence will show that Victor Hale systematically bought and sold children for profit over a period of at least 3 years, that he murdered his own brother to prevent exposure of his crimes, and that he attempted to murder Sarah Hale and 7 children to maintain his cover. The evidence is neither fabricated nor based on personal grievance. It is based on documented fact. We'll see about that, Victor's lawyer said smoothly. Judge Hendrick's eyes narrowed. You'll see about it by presenting your case in the proper order, counsel. Prosecution, call your first witness. The people call Sarah Hale to the stand. Sarah's legs felt like water as she stood. Jonah squeezed her hand once, his eyes fierce with pride and love. Then she walked to the witness stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. The whole truth. Nothing but the truth. And for the next 2 hours, she did exactly that. She told the jury about taking the job at the Hale Foundation, about slowly noticing discrepancies, about the children who disappeared without proper records. She detailed how she'd started her own investigation, keeping careful notes, copying documents when Victor wasn't looking. She described the night she'd shown the evidence to James Hale, the way he'd believed her immediately, his promise to go to the authorities. And what happened next? The prosecutor asked gently. James confronted Victor in his office. The children and I were in the next room, sorting donated clothes. We heard them arguing, heard James say he was going to the marshals, that the selling of children was over. Sarah's voice stayed steady, though her hands gripped the armrest. Then we heard the gunshot. What did you do? I ran to the door, looked through. Victor was standing over his brother's body holding a gun. James was on the floor, blood spreading across his chest. He was still alive, trying to speak. She met Victor's eyes across the courtroom. Victor saw me, pointed the gun at the door. I grabbed the children and we ran. The prosecution walked her through the flight from Denver, the children's testimony about what they'd witnessed, the bullet she'd taken protecting them. Every detail supported by evidence. The journal with its meticulous records, medical reports from Jonah's treatment of her wound, statements from Sheriff Webb about the condition they'd arrived in. Then came the cross-examination. Victor's lawyer approached with a predatory smile. Miss Hale, you claim to have worked at the Hale Foundation for a year. Is that correct? Yes? And during that year you had access to all financial records, all adoption files, all documentation related to the children's care? Yes. So you had the means and opportunity to falsify documents, create fraudulent records, embezzle funds, and blame it on my client? I didn't. You also had a personal relationship with James Hale, did you not? Meeting privately, exchanging correspondence? Sarah's face flushed. He was helping me investigate his brother's crimes, that's all. Or perhaps you and James Hale were having an affair. Perhaps you convinced him to help you steal from Victor, and when he got cold feet, you shot him. Perhaps this entire story is an elaborate fiction to cover your own crimes. That's a lie, Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage. Is it? You're a single woman with no family, no prospects. James Hale was a wealthy, handsome lawyer. It wouldn't be the first time an ambitious woman used her feminine wiles to— Objection! The prosecutor was on his feet. Counsel is attacking the witness's character with baseless accusations. Sustained. Judge Hendrick's voice was sharp. Counsel, stick to the evidence or sit down. But the damage was done. Sarah could see some jury members looking at her with speculation, doubt creeping into their expressions. This was Victor's strategy. Make her seem unstable, vindictive, morally compromised. Make the jury question whether a woman like her could be trusted. The lawyer continued, softer now, but no less cutting. Miss Hale, you admit you kidnapped 7 children from their legal guardian. I saved them from being sold, but you had no legal authority to take them. You simply decided on your own that you knew better than the courts, better than the law. You took children that didn't belong to you and ran across state lines. That's kidnapping by definition. It's not kidnapping to save children from slavery. My client never enslaved anyone. He ran a legitimate adoption service, finding homes for unwanted children. If some of those placements were with families who worked in mining or railroad, he sold them, Sarah interrupted, her voice ringing through the courtroom. Sold them like cattle to men who worked them to death. Tommy Mitchell's brother was 12 years old when Victor sold him to a mining company. 12. And Tommy hasn't seen them in 2 years because no one will say where he is, or even if he's still alive. You have no proof. I have 3 years of records. Sarah's composure finally broke. She pulled the journal from her pocket and held it up. Every name, every date, every dollar your client made from selling children. It's all here, documented in his own ledgers that I copied before I left. You can attack my character all you want, but you can't change what's written here. You can't erase the truth." The courtroom erupted. Judge Hendricks slammed his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Victor's face had gone white, his lawyers scrambling to confer. The jury sat transfixed, several of them staring at the journal like it might bite. When order was finally restored, the prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the defense has opened the door. I'd like to enter into evidence Sarah Hale's journal, along with the corresponding financial records seized from Victor Hale's office that corroborate every entry." The judge nodded grimly. So entered. The rest of Sarah's testimony went quickly. The lawyer tried to regain control, but the moment had shifted. The jury had seen her passion, her conviction, her willingness to stand against attack and speak truth, even when it cost her. They'd seen the journal, the evidence she'd risked everything to preserve. When she finally stepped down, Jonah was there to catch her, as her knees buckled. He supported her back to their seats while the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. "You were magnificent," he whispered against her hair. "I lost my temper." "You told the truth." Exactly the way it needed to be told. The prosecution called Rebecca Hale next. James's widow testified with quiet dignity about her husband's horror when he'd learned what his brother was doing, about his determination to stop it, about the threats Victor had made. Then came the federal investigators, methodically walking the jury through evidence that supported every word of Sarah's testimony. By the time they recessed for the day, Victor's confident facade had crumbled. His lawyers huddled around him, voices low and urgent. He'd counted on destroying Sarah's credibility, on making her seem hysterical and unreliable. Instead, she'd emerged as the hero of her own story, brave, principled, unbreakable. That night, back at the hotel, Sarah finally let herself collapse. Jonah held her while she shook, the adrenaline and terror of the day finally catching up. "It's not over yet," she whispered. "He could still win. The jury could still believe his lawyers." "They won't. You gave them truth. That matters." "Does it? In a world where men like Victor have power?" "It has to," Jonah said fiercely. "It has to matter. Because if it doesn't, then everything you've fought for, everything you've sacrificed, was for nothing. And I don't believe that. I won't believe that." Sarah held on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world gone mad. And maybe he was. Maybe he was exactly what she needed. Not someone who'd protect her from the fight, but someone who'd stand beside her in it. Someone who believed, despite everything, that truth still had power, that justice still mattered, that love could survive even in the darkest places. Tomorrow they'd return to the courtroom. Tomorrow, Victor's lawyers would call their witnesses, spin their version of events, try to resurrect their client's shattered reputation. But tonight, Sarah let herself believe that she'd done enough, said enough, fought hard enough, that maybe, finally, justice would prevail. Morning came too soon, pale light filtering through hotel curtains that did nothing to keep out the cold. Sarah woke wrapped in Jonah's arms, his steady breathing the only sound in the pre-dawn silence. For a moment, she let herself pretend they were back at the ranch, that the trial was over, that everything had turned out the way it should. Then reality crashed back and she remembered where they were, what today would bring. "I can feel you thinking," Jonah murmured against her hair. "Can't help it. Today they call Luke to testify." Jonah's arms tightened around her. The prosecutors had decided that Luke's testimony was essential. A 13-year-old boy who'd witnessed James Hale's murder, who could describe in calm, clear detail exactly what Victor had done. But asking a child to face his abuser in a courtroom full of strangers felt like another kind of violence. "He's ready," Jonah said. "Stronger than any of us give him credit for." He shouldn't have to be this strong. He should be worried about school and friends and normal 13-year-old things, not standing up in court against a man who threatened to sell him to a mining company. "I know. But he wants to do this. He told me last night that testifying is the only way he can fight back, the only way he can protect the others." Sarah closed her eyes, thinking of the boy who'd become the protector of 6 younger children, who'd carried responsibilities no child should bear. "When this is over, I want him to just be a kid again, all of them. I want them to have the childhood Victor stole from them. Then we make that happen, whatever it takes." They dressed in silence, helping each other with buttons and ties like soldiers preparing for battle. In the adjoining room, Emma was already awake, braiding Ruth's hair while Lily sat watching with solemn eyes. The boys were quiet, Luke sitting by the window staring at nothing while Tommy and Ben stayed close to him. "You don't have to do this," Sarah told Luke over breakfast that none of them could eat. "If it's too much, we'll find another way." Luke's jaw set in that stubborn line she'd come to know so well. There is no other way. The jury needs to hear what happened from someone who was there, from someone Victor couldn't buy or scare into silence. He met her eyes, and she saw steel in those young features. "I'm doing this. For James. For all the kids Victor sold. For Peter." Tommy flinched at his brother's name. Sarah reached across the table and gripped both boys' hands. "Then we'll be right there with you, every single moment." The courtroom was even more packed than the day before, word having spread about Sarah's dramatic testimony. People lined the walls, reporters filled the front rows, and the air felt electric with anticipation. Victor sat at the defense table looking smaller somehow, his expensive suit unable to hide the fact that the trial was slipping away from him. His lawyers had spent the previous afternoon calling character witnesses, wealthy Denver citizens who testified to Victor's generosity, his charitable work, his devotion to helping orphan children. But the prosecution had systematically dismantled each one, revealing financial connections, payments made, favors owed. By the end of the day, the defense's carefully constructed image of Victor Hale as a philanthropic saint had crumbled into rubble. Now came the moment that could seal his fate. The people called Luke Mitchell to the stand. Luke stood, his spine straight, his face calm despite the tremor in his hands. He walked to the witness stand like he was walking to an execution, and Sarah's heart broke watching him. Jonah's hand found hers, squeezing tight. The boy took the oath in a clear voice, then settled into the chair. He looked impossibly young sitting there, surrounded by lawyers and judges and the trappings of adult justice. But his eyes were old, aged by things no child should have seen. The prosecutor approached gently. "Luke, can you tell us how you came to live at the Hale Foundation?" "My parents died when I was 9. Fever took them both within a week. My brother Tommy and I had nowhere to go, so the county sent us to Victor Hale's orphanage." Luke's voice was steady, factual. "We were there for 4 years. What was life like at the orphanage?" "Hard. We worked from dawn to dark, cleaning, cooking, doing laundry. The older kids were hired out to local businesses, and Victor kept the wages. He said we had to earn our keep." Luke paused. "But the worst part was never knowing if you'd be next." "Next for what?" "Next to disappear. Kids would be there one day and gone the next. Victor would say they'd been adopted, found good homes. But we knew better. We heard things, saw things, knew that adoption meant being sold to whoever had the money." "Can you describe the night James Hale was killed?" Luke took a breath, his hands gripping the armrests. "It was in February about a year ago. Sarah had been working there for a few months by then. She was different from the other adults. She actually saw us. Talked to us like we were people, not just problems to manage. That night she called all of us into the sorting room and asked us to help organize donated clothes." "Was that unusual?" "Very. We usually worked alone or in pairs. But Sarah wanted us all together. I didn't understand why until later. She was protecting us, keeping us close because she knew something was about to happen." The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. "What happened next?" "We heard voices from Victor's office. Him and his brother James, arguing. James was saying that what Victor was doing was illegal, immoral, that it had to stop. Victor kept saying James didn't understand the business, that the children were better off in working homes than rotting in orphanages." Luke's voice hardened. "Then James said he was going to the marshals, that he had evidence and he was going to make sure Victor faced justice. And then we heard the gunshot, just one, loud enough that we all jumped. Sarah told us to stay put and ran to the door." Luke looked directly at the jury now, his young face fierce. "But I followed her. I looked through the door and saw Victor standing over his brother's body with a smoking gun in his hand. James was on the floor, bleeding, trying to talk. And Victor just stood there watching him die." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling notes, frozen by the weight of a child's testimony. "What did Victor do next?" the prosecutor asked quietly. "He looked up and saw Sarah at the door, saw me behind her. He pointed the gun at us and said if we ever told anyone what we'd seen, he'd make sure we all disappeared to places nobody would ever find us. Said we belonged to him and he could do whatever he wanted with us." "Did you believe him?" "Yes, sir, we all did. We'd seen what happened to kids who made trouble. They'd get sent to the worst places, mines that collapsed, railroads where accidents happened, farms where children worked until they dropped. Victor made examples of anyone who didn't obey." The prosecutor let that sink in before continuing. "What happened after that night?" "Sarah started planning our escape. She knew Victor would kill her to cover up what he'd done, and probably us too since we'd witnessed it. She gathered evidence, made copies of records, and then 3 days before her trial for James's murder, she broke us out. All 7 of us. We ran." "Why did you go with her?" Luke looked at Sarah and his eyes filled with tears for the first time. "Because she was the only adult who'd ever chosen us over her own safety. She could have run alone, been faster, harder to track. But she took us with her, took responsibility for 7 kids she didn't know anything to." His voice cracked. "She saved us. In every way a person can be saved." The defense attorney stood for cross-examination, but there was hesitation in his movements now. He knew what the jury had just heard, knew the power of a child's unwavering testimony. "Luke, you were very young when this allegedly happened. Are you certain about what you saw? Could you have been mistaken about who held the gun?" "No, sir. I know what I saw." "But it was February. Dark. You were frightened. Perhaps in your fear you misremembered." "I remember everything about that night, sir. I remember the color of the blood on the floor. I remember the smell of gunpowder. I remember James's last words." Luke's voice was rock steady. He said the children. That's all. Just the children. He was trying to tell Victor not to hurt us, even while he was dying, and Victor laughed. The lawyer's face paled. "Luke, isn't it true that Sarah Hale coached you on what to say? That she told you what story to tell to protect herself?" "Sarah never told me to lie. She told me to tell the truth, even if it was hard, even if it hurt." Luke leaned forward. "Everything I've said today is true. Victor Hale murdered his brother. He threatened to kill us. He sold children for money. And if you let him go free, he'll do it again. He'll keep doing it until someone stops him." The lawyer tried a few more questions, but each answer Luke gave was calm, consistent, unshakable. The boy had lived through nightmares that would have broken most adults, and he refused to be intimidated by a lawyer in an expensive suit asking leading questions. When Luke finally stepped down, he walked straight to Sarah and collapsed into her arms. She held him while he shook, finally letting himself be the frightened child he'd been holding at bay. Jonah gathered them both, and they sat like that while the prosecutor called his next witness. Tommy took the stand next, testifying about his brother Peter's disappearance, about the bill of sale Sarah had found showing Peter sold to a mining company for $200. Then Ben, describing the beatings administered to children who questioned where the others had gone. Each testimony built on the last, creating a picture of systematic abuse and exploitation that left the jury visibly shaken. By the time the children finished testifying, Victor's lawyers looked defeated, but they put their client on the stand anyway, a last desperate attempt to salvage the unsalvageable. Victor testified that he'd been trying to help orphan children, that Sarah Hale had been unstable and vindictive when he'd refused her romantic advances, that his brother's death had been a tragic accident that Sarah had twisted into murder. He claimed the children had been coached, that the financial records were forgeries, that he was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy. But his voice lacked conviction now. His smooth confidence had eroded under the weight of evidence and testimony. When the prosecutor cross-examined him, Victor's carefully constructed lies fell apart piece by piece. "Mr. Hale, you claim the children were placed in good homes. Can you name a single family that adopted a child from your foundation?" Victor fumbled, unable to produce a name. "You claim Sarah Hale forged financial records. Yet those records match exactly with your own ledgers seized by federal investigators. Are you saying she somehow gained access to your private files and created perfect forgeries?" "She must have. I don't know how." "You claim your brother's death was an accident. Yet 7 children and 1 adult all testified to hearing you argue with him, hearing a single gunshot, and seeing you standing over his body with a weapon. Are they all lying? They must be. Sarah turned them against me? Mr. Hale, you sold children. You murdered your brother. You shot Sarah Hale and attempted to murder 7 children to cover your crimes. The evidence is overwhelming. Why don't you simply admit what you've done? Victor's face twisted with rage. I gave those children purpose. I gave them value. They were nothing before I took them in. They were human beings, the prosecutor thundered. Children who deserved protection and care, not to be bought and sold like livestock. They were orphans. Nobody wanted them. I found them homes, gave them opportunities. You sold a 12-year-old boy to a mining company for $200. You call that an opportunity? And finally, Victor broke. Those children were mine to do with as I pleased. I fed them, housed them, gave them purpose. If some of them ended up in difficult situations, well, life is difficult. At least they were useful instead of rotting in some institution. The courtroom erupted. Judge Hendricks slammed his gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the damage was done. Victor had just admitted everything, the selling, the exploitation, the fundamental belief that children's lives belonged to him to dispose of as he wished. His lawyers tried damage control during redirect, but it was hopeless. The jury had heard Victor Hale condemn himself in his own words. Closing arguments were almost anticlimactic after that. The prosecution methodically reviewed the evidence, the testimony, Victor's own damning words. The defense made a half-hearted attempt to argue reasonable doubt, but even they seemed to know it was over. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Sarah sat between Jonah and Luke in the courtroom, surrounded by the children, waiting for the verdict that would determine all their futures. Her hands were ice cold despite the warmth of the room, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. When the jury filed back in, she couldn't read their faces. They looked grave, determined, but whether that meant conviction or acquittal, she couldn't tell. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Hendricks asked. "We have, Your Honor." The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper with steady hands. "In the matter of the United States versus Victor Hale on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of James Hale, how do you find?" "Guilty." Sarah's breath left her in a rush. Beside her, Luke made a choked sound. Jonah's hand tightened on hers. "On the charge of kidnapping and child trafficking?" "Guilty." "On the charges of fraud and conspiracy?" "Guilty on all counts." The courtroom exploded into noise, cheering, shouting, reporters rushing for doors to file their stories. Victor sat frozen at the defense table, his face ashen, his world collapsing around him. His lawyers were already filing motions, calling for appeals. But everyone knew it was over. Judge Hendricks restored order with difficulty. "Victor Hale, you have been found guilty of heinous crimes against the most vulnerable members of our society. Sentencing will be held 1 week from today, but I can tell you now that you will spend the rest of your natural life in prison. You will never again have the opportunity to harm a child. Court is adjourned." Sarah didn't remember standing, didn't remember the children surrounding her, crying and laughing and holding on to each other. Didn't remember Rebecca Hale crossing the courtroom to embrace her, both women weeping for James, for justice finally served. What she remembered was Jonah pulling her against his chest, his voice rough in her ear. "It's over. You did it. You won." "We won," she corrected, her tears soaking into his shirt. "All of us together." The children clung to them both, 7 voices all talking at once, releasing weeks of fear and uncertainty in a flood of relief and joy. Luke stood slightly apart, his face streaming with tears he'd held back for so long. "Peter," he said when Sarah looked at him. "We have to find Peter now. We have to bring him home." "We will," she promised. "We'll use Victor's records, hire investigators, search every mine in Wyoming until we find him, however long it takes." "I want to help. I want to be the one who tells him he's free." Sarah pulled the boy into a fierce embrace. "Then that's what we'll do, together." That night, they celebrated in the hotel with a meal that tasted like victory. Simple food made extraordinary by the knowledge that they were finally, truly safe. The children talked over each other, planning what they'd do when they got back to the ranch, arguing good-naturedly about who'd get which chores, making plans for a future they'd never been certain they'd have. Later, After the young ones had fallen asleep exhausted by emotion, Sarah and Jonah stood at the window looking out at Denver's lights. Somewhere in this city, Victor Hale sat in a cell, his empire destroyed, his crimes exposed. Somewhere, children he'd sold were beginning the long journey toward freedom as federal investigators tracked down every transaction, every buyer, every victim. "What are you thinking?" Jonah asked. "That it's not enough. Convicting Victor doesn't undo the damage he caused, doesn't bring back the childhoods he stole or heal the trauma he inflicted. No, but it stops him from hurting anyone else, and it gives those children a chance at justice, at healing. Sometimes that has to be enough." Sarah turned to face him, this man who'd taken in fugitives and fought for strangers and given her back her faith in human goodness. "When we get back to Montana, I want to get married. Not a big ceremony, just us and the children and maybe Marcus Webb to make it official. I don't want to wait anymore." Jonah's face split into a grin. "Yes, absolutely yes. And then I want to start the search for Peter and all the other children. I want to build something. A foundation, maybe, or a network. Something that helps children like ours, that fights men like Victor before they can do this kind of damage. Then that's what we'll do. Whatever you need, however long it takes, I'm with you." She kissed him, pouring everything she felt into it, gratitude and love and hope for a future she'd stopped believing was possible. When they broke apart, both were crying, but these were good tears. Healing tears. The next week passed in a blur of legal proceedings and preparations to leave Denver. The federal prosecutors were building cases against everyone who'd bought children from Victor, and they needed Sarah's continued cooperation. She gave it gladly, spending hours with investigators, helping them decode Victor's records and track down victims. They found Peter on the 5th day. He was alive, working in a silver mine in Wyoming, but the 14-year-old who stumbled out into daylight barely resembled the boy Tommy remembered. He was gaunt, scarred, his hands permanently blackened from coal dust. But his eyes lit up when he saw Tommy running toward him, and the brothers collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing. Sarah watched from a distance, Jonah's arm around her waist, as the Mitchell brothers reunited. This was why she'd fought. This moment, this joy, this family being stitched back together. If she'd accomplished nothing else in her life, this would be enough. They brought Peter back to the hotel, fed him, clothed him, let him cry and rage, and slowly begin to believe he was really free. Luke hovered close, protective and tender, while Tommy refused to leave his brother's side. The other children welcomed him carefully, giving him space to heal while making it clear he belonged. Victor's sentencing came on a gray March morning. The courtroom was packed again, but this time Sarah barely noticed the crowds. She sat in the front row with her family, 7 children who were becoming hers through love and law, and Jonah, who'd already become her husband in everything but paperwork. Judge Hendricks was merciless in his condemnation. "Victor Hale, you have been convicted of crimes that shock the conscience. You took vulnerable children and treated them as commodities. You murdered your own brother to hide your depravity. You attempted to murder 7 children and the woman who sought to protect them. The law allows for mercy, but you have shown none and deserve none in return. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. May you spend your remaining years contemplating the lives you destroyed." Victor stood to speak, probably hoping for some last manipulation, some final play for sympathy. But before he could start, Rebecca Hale stood in the gallery. "You killed my husband," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You orphaned my children. You sold babies for profit and called it charity. And now you'll die in prison, forgotten and alone, while the children you tried to destroy build beautiful lives without you. That's justice." Victor's mouth opened, closed. For the first time since the trial began, he had nothing to say. The guards led him away, and Sarah watched him go, feeling nothing but a profound sense of closure. This chapter was ending. Finally, mercifully ending. But that wasn't quite true. 3 days later, the prison warden sent word that Victor had hanged himself in his cell using torn bedsheets. He'd left a letter, a confession, detailing every child he'd sold, every crime he'd committed, clearing Sarah's name completely and legally transferring guardianship of the 7 children to her and Jonah Carter. The news should have brought relief. Instead, Sarah felt a strange emptiness. "He took the easy way out," she told Jonah. "Got to escape justice after all." "No. He died in chains, his reputation destroyed, his life's work exposed as monstrous. That's not escape. That's defeat." Jonah held her close. "And his confession gives us everything we need to legally adopt the children, to search for the others he sold, to finish what you started. Even in death, he's helping undo the damage he caused." Sarah wanted to argue, but she was too tired, too ready to be done with Denver, with trials, with Victor Hale's shadow hanging over everything. "Let's go home," she said. "Please. I just want to go home." They left the next morning, all 9 of them plus Peter, taking the train north toward Montana and the ranch that waited like a promise. The children pressed against windows, watching Colorado give way to Wyoming, Wyoming to Montana, the landscape transforming from brown to white, from plains to mountains, from past to future. Marcus Webb met them at the station with wagons and horses, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw them all together. "Welcome home," he said simply, and Sarah nearly wept at how good those words sounded. The ranch looked exactly as they'd left it, but somehow more beautiful. The house sturdy against the snow, smoke rising from the chimney, the barn warm with horses and cattle. Home. Not just a building or a piece of land, but the place where they belonged. That night they gathered in the main room, 9 children, 2 adults, and 1 old ranch dog who'd missed them all terribly. Sarah looked around at faces she'd fought for, nearly died for, and felt something settle deep in her chest. Peace. Actual, genuine peace for the first time in years. "I have an announcement," she said when dinner was finished. "Jonah and I are getting married tomorrow. Marcus has agreed to perform the ceremony, and after that, we're going to start the legal process of adopting all of you, making this family official." The children erupted in cheers. Lily launched herself at Sarah. Ruth started crying happy tears. The boys pounded Jonah on the back like he'd just won a great victory. Even Peter, still healing and wary, managed a smile. Emma raised her hand timidly. "Can I make your wedding dress? I've been practicing sewing, and I'd like to make you something special." "I'd be honored," Sarah said, her throat tight. The wedding was small and perfect. Sarah wore a simple dress of cream muslin that Emma had somehow transformed into something beautiful overnight. Jonah wore his best suit, his hair slicked back, looking nervous and happy and absolutely certain. They stood in the main room surrounded by children and Marcus Webb, who read from a prayer book with gruff tenderness. When it came time for vows, Jonah spoke first. "Sarah, you walked into my life during a blizzard and woke me up from 3 years of just existing. You showed me what it means to fight for something that matters, to choose courage over safety, to build a family from broken pieces and love that doesn't quit. I promise to stand beside you, to protect what we're building, to love you and these children for the rest of my life." Sarah's turn. "Jonah, you took us in when you had every reason to turn us away. You gave us safety when we'd forgotten what that felt like. You showed me that good men still exist, that honor and kindness aren't just fairy tale concepts. I promise to build a life with you, to fight beside you for the children who still need saving, to love you with everything I have for as long as I live." Marcus pronounced them husband and wife, and the children cheered as Jonah kissed his bride. It wasn't fancy or elaborate. There was no music, no flowers, no guests beyond their small family. But it was real and true and perfect. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Sarah and Jonah stood on the porch watching stars wheel overhead. She wore Martha's ring now, and it didn't feel like replacing someone. It felt like honoring her, continuing the legacy of love Martha had started. "What happens next?" Jonah asked. "We find the rest of the children Victor sold. We build that foundation I talked about. We make sure this never happens to anyone else." Sarah leaned into his warmth. "And we raise our family. Teach them that they're loved and valued and safe. Give them the childhood they should have had from the beginning." Sounds like a lot of work. The best kind of work. They stood together as snow began to fall, soft and clean, covering the world in white. Inside, 8 children slept peacefully, dreaming of a future that was finally secure. And 2 people who'd found each other in the darkest circumstances held on to each other, building something beautiful from ashes and hope. The fight wasn't over. There were still children to find, systems to change, justice to pursue. But tonight, they had peace, they had family, they had home. And sometimes, that was more than enough. It was everything. 3 months later, Sarah stood in what used to be Jonah's office, now transformed into the headquarters of the Mountain West Children's Alliance. Maps covered the walls, marked with locations where Victor's victims had been found. Files lined shelves, each one representing a child they were searching for, a family they were trying to reunite. They'd found 17 children so far. Some had been returned to relatives they didn't remember. Others, like Peter, had nowhere to go and had joined the growing family at the ranch. Jonah had built an addition to the house, adding bedrooms and a schoolroom, transforming his lonely bachelor ranch into something that hummed with life and purpose. Emma taught the younger children their letters. Luke and the older boys ran the ranch with Jonah, learning skills that would serve them the rest of their lives. And Sarah coordinated the search efforts, working with federal investigators and local sheriffs across 3 states, slowly but surely bringing Victor's victims home. On a warm June evening, a telegram arrived. They'd found another child, a girl sold to a factory in Chicago, rescued by federal marshals acting on Sarah's information. She was being sent west and would arrive in 3 days. That makes 18, Jonah said, reading over Sarah's shoulder. 18 lives saved. There are 63 more on Victor's list, and probably others he never recorded. Sarah looked at the map, at all the marks representing children still lost. It's going to take years. Then it takes years. We've got time. Sarah turned in his arms, this man who'd become her partner in every way that mattered. I'm pregnant, she said. Jonah froze. You're... what? Pregnant. About 3 months, the doctor thinks. I wasn't sure if I should tell you with everything else going on, but... He kissed her, fierce and joyful, then dropped to his knees and pressed his face against her still flat stomach. We're having a baby. An actual baby. We have 8 children already, Sarah laughed. 9 if you count the one arriving Tuesday. But this one, he looked up at her, eyes shining. This one we get to raise from the beginning. Get to give them the childhood all those others deserved. That night, they told the children. The reaction was mixed. The girls were thrilled, already planning how they'd help with the baby. The boys were more reserved, but Sarah saw Luke smile when he thought no one was looking. Later, when she was tucking Lily into bed, the little girl asked, Will you still love us when you have a baby of your own? Sarah's heart broke a little. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled Lily close. Sweet girl, you are my own. You and Luke and Tommy and Peter and Ben and Emma and Ruth and Sam and David. Biology doesn't make a family. Love does. And I love all of you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. Promise? I promise. You're stuck with me forever, whether you like it or not. Lily giggled and snuggled under the quilt. I like it. The months that followed were full of the beautiful chaos of a large family finding its rhythm. They added more children, not planned, but unable to turn away those who needed help. By the time Sarah's baby was born in February, they had 14 children ranging from age 5 to 16, plus one screaming newborn girl they named Hope. Hope Martha Carter arrived during a snowstorm, delivered by a midwife with Jonah pacing outside and 8 terrified children hovering nearby. When Sarah finally emerged, exhausted but glowing, holding a red-faced bundle, the children crowded around to meet their new sister. She's so small, Ruth whispered in wonder. You were that small once, Emma told her. Can I hold her? Luke asked, surprising everyone. Sarah placed the baby in his arms carefully, showing him how to support her head. The 13-year-old boy who'd witnessed murder and carried a dying woman through a blizzard looked down at the newborn with an expression of such tender wonder that Sarah had to look away before she started crying again. Hey there, Hope, Luke said softly. I'm your big brother. I've got 7 sisters and 6 brothers now, so you're going to have a lot of people looking out for you. You're lucky. You get to grow up safe and loved and free. That's what your mama fought for. That's what we all fought for. The baby yawned, utterly unconcerned with the weight of those words, and watching her children, all of them, born of her body or born of her heart, surrounding the newest member of their family, Sarah felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible. This was what she'd fought for. This moment. This family. This home built from courage and stubbornness and love that refused to quit. Victor Hale had tried to break her, had tried to break all of them. But they'd survived. More than survived. They'd thrived. They'd built something beautiful from the ruins he'd left behind. Jonah came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "You did good," he said quietly. "We did good," she corrected, "all of us together." And standing in their crowded, chaotic, perfect home, surrounded by children who'd learned that family was something you chose and fought for and built with your own hands, Sarah finally let herself believe it. They'd won. Not just the trial, not just the fight against Victor Hale, but something bigger. They'd won the right to define their own family, to create their own future, to prove that love was stronger than fear and hope was worth fighting for. The scars would always be there. The memories of what they'd survived would never fully fade. But they'd face it together, this found family bound by choice rather than blood, by love rather than law. And that, Sarah thought as she watched her husband hold their newborn daughter, while their other children planned what stories they'd tell her when she was old enough to understand, was more than enough. It was everything. Years later, when people asked Sarah Carter about the trial that had made headlines across the Western Territories, about the man who tried to destroy her and the children she'd saved, she would think carefully before answering. She could tell them about the fear, about running through snow with a bullet wound, about standing in a courtroom and fighting for justice. She could tell them about Victor Hale's crimes, about the children he'd sold, about the brother he'd murdered. But that wasn't the story that mattered. The story that mattered was about 8 children who'd carried a dying woman to safety because they refused to leave her behind. About a widowed rancher who'd opened his home to strangers and found family. About a town sheriff who'd chosen truth over easy money. About a murdered man's widow who'd testified despite her grief because it was right. The story that mattered was about ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't. And in the end, that was the only story worth telling. The story of how broken people built something whole, how scattered children became a family, how a house became a home, how courage and love proved stronger than money and power and fear. That was the story Sarah Carter told her children and grandchildren, sitting on the porch of the ranch that had sheltered them all, watching the Montana sun set over land that had become synonymous with safety. That was the story worth remembering, and it was true. Every beautiful, hard-won word of it was true.